Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to episode number 5. We're back at a familiar place, the Wynn, to take a shot at a tournament for a change. I haven't played a live tournament in almost a year, so we'll see how rusty I am. We buy in for $240 and start off with $25,000 in chips. The blinds are 100-100 with a 100 big blind ante. The button opens to 300. We look down at ace king off in the small blind and raise it up to 1300. He thinks for a second and calls. The flop is king 5-2 with 2 hearts. After 3 betting, this is the flop I'll continue on with basically all of my range, so I put out a small bet of 700. I undercounted the pot by a little, so this should have been a bit larger, around 1000. The button pretty quickly raises to 2500, which I wasn't expecting. I'll have more strong kings in my range than him, but I guess he has the king 5 suited, pocket 5s, and pocket 2s that I'll never have. The speed of his raise made me think it was an easy decision for him, so either a strong hand like 2 pair or a set, or a clear flush draw. Turning a hand like pocket 6s or 7s with a heart into a bluff would take a few seconds of consideration at least. I call, looking for any card but a heart on the turn. The turn does not oblige, bringing the 4 of hearts. I check and he puts out a bet of 3500. I know GTO is always calling here, but I just had a hard time seeing what I was ahead of. I didn't think he was overvaluing a hand like king queen, and now except for a wild 4-3 suited, he hit his draws. If I had a heart, I would have stuck around, but I went with a tight fold this time. Blinds are at 100-100, and I open pocket 9s to 300 under the gun, 6-handed, and I get 3 callers: button, small blind, and big blind. The flop is king queen 9 with 2 diamonds. It checks to me, and multi-way, I think this is a board I'll be checking pretty often, so I get a little trappy with bottom set and check it back. The button checks behind. The turn is the ace of diamonds. I guess if the turn had to be a diamond, the ace is alright since it blocks the most flushes. The small blind checks and the big blind bets 1500. I call and the button folds. The small blind folds behind. The river is a blank 6 of clubs. Now the big blind checks, and I think he would keep betting his straights and flushes since I checked back the flop and only called on the turn, so that gives me the green light to go for some value. I bet 2500 looking to get called by 2 pair or an ace. The big blind doesn't love it, and after grumbling for a bit, he finds the call. I turn over my set and he flashes an ace as he throws his cards into the muck. This next one is a bit of a funky one. The blinds are 100-200 and we open pocket 8s under the gun to 600. 1 blue 500 chip and 1 gray 100 chip. It folds around to the big blind who tosses out a red 5k chip, taking back one of its gray 100 chips, which is a raise to 5100 instead of just calling. Looking to get a read, I ask him,
"Did you mean to do that?"
and don't get much of a reaction. I think this is one of those fake misclicks where they want you to think they meant to call and put in all those chips by accident. I folded my 8s face up, and seeing how nitty this guy played over the next few hours, I am positive he was sitting on at least kings. Early position opens to 600 and gets called by the cutoff and button. I look down at 5-3 off in the big blind and make an ill-advised call. I don't know what I'm doing. It's almost connected. The poker gods reward my bad play with a good flop of 7-4 deuce rainbow. It checks to the button who bets 1500. I probably should be raising here, but just call. The cutoff calls too. We bank the turn with a 6 of diamonds. I check, the cutoff checks, and unfortunately the button checks too. The river is a disconnected jack, which doesn't change anything. I size up to try and make it look like I'm stealing the pot and bet 4500. The cutoff folds and the button goes into the tank before eventually finding the fold. The blinds are 200, 400, 400, and we open 6-4 of diamonds on the button to 1000. Just the small blind calls. The flop is queen 10-9 with 1 diamond. The small blind checks and I put out a small bet of 800, looking to get a cheap fold from an ace high hand. He calls. The turn is a 4 and now the small blind leads into me for 800. I have no idea what this bet is, but we didn't turn a pair just to fold and put in the call. The river rolls off a blank 3 and now he checks. The small bet check line feels so weak, but I'm wondering if I need to bluff with my 4s. I'm hoping he missed whatever he was looking for and check it back. He flips over ace jack off and can't believe his eyes when I show the 6-4 for the win. Early position opens to 1000. We pick up ace queen of hearts in middle position and raise to 2500. It folds back around and he calls. The flop is jack 6-5 with 1 heart. He checks and I continue for 2000 and he calls. The turn is the 9 of hearts. He checks again. I know GTO generally prefers to check behind with draws to realize equity, but you can still bet with some of them. I thought another bet would get him to fold stuff like ace king or middling pairs, so I bet 4,000 and he folded. This next one was one of the most interesting hands of the tourney for me. The blinds are 400, 800, 800, and a pro opens under the gun to 2,000. It folds to me in the big blind with pocket 10s and I call. The flop is ace 8-4 with 2 diamonds. I check and he continues for 1200. With only 1 overcard, it's an easy call. The turn is another 8, and this is a card that is much better for the big blind range. I think we do a bunch of leading on this turn, so I bet 2300. It doesn't need to be huge. He calls. The river is the blankest of blanks and offsuit deuce. I think my hand is too strong to bluff, but if I bet, it's hard to see what worse hands can call me. I check to see what happens. What happens is I face a massive bet of 9,000, which sends me deep into the tank. I could still have a lot of 8s in my range, and I know he knows that, so I'm pretty confused. I ask him,
"You not worried I have an 8?
I am worried about that."
And his response sounds genuine. That helps eliminate some 8s from his range, but I wouldn't put it past him to blast off with an ace like this, looking for max value against a worse ace. So his value could be hands like ace king, maybe ace queen. What are his bluffs? It would have to be missed diamonds, and I did not like having the 10 of diamonds in my hand. That blocked a bunch of his missed draws like king 10, queen 10, jack 10, 10-9, and even 10-7 of diamonds. He could still have king queen, king jack, queen jack, king 9, or jack 9 of diamonds for 5 combos of bluffs versus a bunch of ace kings and ace queens. In the end, I felt like having the 10 of diamonds in my hand just removed too many of his bluffs and went with a fold. A little while later, he told me he had king 9 of diamonds. Sick hand. Let's see how I played this one in GTO Wizard. Facing an under the gun open, we call with pocket 10s in the big blind about 75% of the time. I know I am not aggro enough from the big blind, and seeing all the hands that GTO likes to raise with only confirms it. It's getting after an under the gun open with hands like king 10 suited, queen 8 suited, and ace 10 off. Stuff you definitely don't see players normally doing. On this ace high flop, we are checking all of the time, and under the gun continues a little over half the time. I think this is another spot that most people mess up and see bet with closer to 100% of their range as a pre-flop aggressor on an ace high board. Could be a good spot to work in some more check raises. Facing this small bet, the 10s are a pure call. It's interesting to note that GTO is finding raises with middle and bottom pair hands here. It looks like going off the removal for sets and 2 pair. The turn 8 is a card that we get to lead about 30% of the time. It looks like GTO mixes leads throughout the whole range except bottom pairs, so betting small with the 10s was fine. Facing the turn lead, under the gun is mainly calling, but raises some 8s and top pairs. On the river deuce, GTO is betting 8s and strong aces for value, balancing with some bluffs that block backdoor straights. The 10s are a mix between betting and checking, with GTO checking more often, holding the 10 of diamonds. After we check the river, under the gun is betting about half the time, but most often with a smaller bet size. Facing this larger size, we're always folding hands like 10s and 9s. You see pocket 7s and 6s find the occasional call here, and I think it's because they let him have a few more missed flush draws to bluff with. Let's try and get our chips back from the pro. Blinds are still 400, 800, 800, and we open queen 8 of diamonds in the cutoff to 2000. The pro calls on the button and the small blind calls too. The flop is ace of diamonds, king of diamonds, 4 of clubs. The small blind checks. With the nut flush draw, we bet a little under half pot, 2500. The button calls and the small blind folds. The turn is the 5 of clubs. We have a much stronger range than the button here since he shouldn't have aces, kings, or ace king. We have all that value to keep betting, so we can keep bluffing too. I bet 6500 and he calls. You know what would be nice? A diamond. Instead, we get the 8 of hearts on the river. I was planning to give up if I missed the river since it's not great to bluff with the missed front door draw, but I started to think more about the button's range. Unless he found 2 pair, he's hanging on with ace rag at best or a king. He's probably raising 2 pair on the flop or turn at some frequency, and having an 8 blocks a couple of his random river 2 pairs. Feels like this is a good spot to go for it, so I put him all in for 9,000. The button does not seem to enjoy this and thinks for a minute before calling. I say you're probably good, and he replies ace, flipping over ace deuce offsuit. I might have to adjust this guy's pro tag because that was not a hand I thought he'd end up with. Was this a punt? Let's take a look in GTOWizard. Queen 8 suited is a normal open from the cutoff. Sometimes you have to adjust a multi-way situation to heads up for the solver, so we'll just focus on the button caller and leave out the small blind. On the ace king 4 2 diamond flop, we're c-betting about 30% of the time. Queen 8 of diamonds is one of the hands it likes to bluff with. The button mainly calls. On the turn 5 of clubs, we are still firing nearly half the time, but this is a spot where I made a mistake. The turn bet should be larger here, with GTO preferring to overbet with nearly 2x the pot with queen 8 of diamonds. Going with that overbet will make him have to fold out some aces, but against a smaller bet, they stick around. On the 8 of hearts river, GTO is never turning queen 8 into a bluff. It does do some bluffing with queen 9, queen 7, queen 6, and jack 6, so I wouldn't call this a total punt, but maybe not the perfect choice of a hand to bluff with. I think the bigger mistake in this hand was the turn sizing, so that's something I'll definitely study up on. Anyways, we rebuy for another 25,000 chips and keep playing on. Through a few rounds of card dead blinds, we find our stack down to around 15,000. Finally, we look down at the jiggities, pocket jacks. The cutoff opens to 3,000 and the button raises to 6,500. We have an easy jam from the small blind. The cutoff folds and the button confirms the count before calling. We turn over our cards and are in great shape versus ace jack of clubs. The flop is clean, the turn is a blank, and we fade the ace on the river. Our stack is up to around 44,000, and there are 131 people left at the end of registration, with an average stack of 57,000. Only 26 are paid, so we still have a ways to go. Which brings us to the most exciting hand of the tourney. Early position limps for 1,200. We're next to act with pocket 8s and raise to 4,000. The small blind calls and the limper comes along too. The flop comes down, jack of diamonds, 10 of hearts, 8 of diamonds, giving us bottom set on a wet board. The small blind checks, and now the early position limper bets 11,000. I had about 40,000 left, and both of them had similar stacks. There was a small chance someone already had a straight, but they have a lot more draws, 2 pair, or pair plus draw type hands. And worst case, I would have some outs for a full house. You already know what's coming, so I said,
All in?
All in?
It doesn't take too long for the small blind to call, and the limper snaps it off too. Oh man, what did I get myself into? I ask the table if anyone already has a straight and no one responds. We flip over our cards and I see the limper has 10-9 of diamonds for the straight flush draw, and the small blind has Jack 9 for top pair and an open ender. What an action flop. Let's see how it goes. Ace of spades, Jack of spades, and we fade the world for a triple up. Blinds are at 1,000, 1,500, 1,500, and early position an older gentleman opens to 4,000. It folds to me in the big blind and I call with ace 7 of spades. The flop comes down ace, jack, 2 with 2 hearts. I check and he bets 4,000. With top pair, no kicker, we have an easy call. The turn is a blank 4. I check and now he bets 7,500. To be honest, I really wasn't loving it. This player type just has a better ace so often, but with the flush draw out there, I got sticky and called. The river is another ace, giving us trips. I check and now he goes all in for a little less than pot. I wasn't loving it on the turn and I still wasn't loving it with trips. I think about it for a while, but just can't find it in me to fold trips and get shown the ace queen. The cutoff opens to 7,500 and we call in the big blind with queen 10 off. The flop comes down 10, 7, 5, rainbow. I check and the cutoff checks back. The turn is another 7. The cutoff could have some 7s in their check back range, but I think my queen 10 is good enough for a value bet and put out 7,500. The cutoff calls. The river is an offsuit king. I think I can still get calls from Jack 10, 10 9, 9s or 8s, and I didn't expect him to hit that king very often. So I put out a small blocker bet of 10,000, which got snap called by ace king. We haven't won a hand in a while, so we're getting a bit short stacked, and we're getting closer to the bubble. Our table breaks, and one of our first hands at the new table, we get pocket 6s in the small blind. It folds to us and we shove, and the big blind calls us with ace 5. We flop a set, but he has a gut shot, and the turn and river peel off safe. We steal a few blinds here and there with some all-ins to stay alive before looking down at 8-5 of diamonds with 10 bigs in the big blind. Early position limps, the button limps, the small blind calls, and we check the big blind. The flop comes down 7, 4, 4 and checks through. The turn is a 3. If anyone had a 4, they probably would have bet the flop, so why not and try and steal this pot? It checks to us, we bet 10,000 and everyone folds. We pick up a few more blinds but are one of the tiny stacks on the stone bubble. After about 20 minutes of hand-for-hand play, someone finally busts on one of the other tables, letting us squeak by into a min cash. A few hands later, we pick up queen 4 suited in the cutoff and go all in with our last 4 bigs. The big blind calls it off with ace 9 and we can't find a pair. Even with the rebuy, we managed to profit for a few $100s, so not bad for a day of poker.